Zack Snyder has just released his 10th film in the form of Rebel Moon. Today, we are going to rank all 10 of Zack Snyder's feature films. Just for context of how this ranking is going to go, a lot of these movies I've not seen before. Aside from his DC stuff, these were all first watches for me, so these are my thoughts after just one viewing of these movies. Also, these are all based off of the theatrical cuts. I know that Snyder has his director cuts and his ultimate editions out there, but I watched the theatrical cuts for this ranking in particular, except for Zack Snyder's Justice League, because we all know he didn't direct the theatrical cut. His name may be on it, but it ain't his.
You disgust me. How can you live with yourself?
And also, make sure to add your list down in the comment section below. This is just my list, and I'm sure your list is going to look a lot different, and I would love to see it. With all that out of the way, let's get started. In last place, we have Legends of the Guardians, The Owls of Ga'Hoole. A weird entry in Snyder's filmography, as this is his first and only kids' family animated film. Now, I will say that the animation in this movie is beautifully done, and the action in the third act, the owls fighting each other, the Snyder flair that is able to be put upon those scenes makes them way more exciting and a little bit more violent than I think a normal kids and family movie would go for. But I also think there's some elements in this story that for a kids and family film don't really work and go a little bit too dark, with some kidnapping and slavery themes that honestly the movie doesn't really feel like it earns to depict. The buildup of these Guardians is not very well done, and the journey that our characters are going on to get to these Guardians I found kind of dull and boring. In the end, I was not the target audience for this. I'm not at the age that I'm sure if you saw this when you were 10 years old in 2010, you probably loved this movie. But as far as my opinion on this movie goes, I gotta say, I did not find this one to be a hoot. Coming in at number 9, Sucker Punch. Now, this was the first original concept, story, and screenplay done by Snyder up until this point in his career, and the result for me was a pretty mixed bag. On the one hand, this movie has some really great and compelling performances by the lead woman of the story, as well as Oscar Isaac, who plays the slimy, despicable villain, keeping all of these ladies trapped in his institution. All of the actors in this film I thought were doing a phenomenal job. And the action scenes were very cool here, and they were really starting to look like the action that we would later get in Snyder's DC films, which I thought was really cool to see almost the origin of that begin. But at the same time, the movie blatantly tells you that when these action sequences are going on, reality isn't going on. This is taking place in a fantasy dream world, basically. So all of the action sequences in this movie just started to feel really hollow to me. And in that way, they just became visual noise that got really boring and loud and pointless. And I almost was tempted to skip them because I knew what was happening in them had zero stakes. And for me, that just killed any chance of them being compelling or exciting. I also found the ending to be incredibly unsatisfying, as it basically just tells you that everything you've just watched was basically a dream sequence. All in all, Sucker Punch had some fun stylized action that you come to expect from Snyder and some good performances, but the movie is really let down by its script and overall execution. Up next, we have Watchmen. So this is based off the beloved graphic novel by Alan Moore. Now, I've never read that graphic novel. I've never read the Alan Moore original, so I'm simply just talking about the movie. Don't get mad at me, fanboys of Alan Moore's comic. I'm not talking about the comic. I'm talking about the movie. And for me, this movie was filled with half-baked ideas that, much like the abundance of characters, I feel like Zack Snyder had trouble juggling them all. I really like the detective noir story going on with Rorschach as he's investigating what happened in the death of one of his fellow superheroes, the comedian. In fact, honestly, Rorschach was the best part of the entire movie. Anytime we cut to him, anytime we saw what he was up to, what he was doing, I was fully invested. I could have just watched a completely solo Rorschach movie. In fact, where is that movie? I want the Rorschach solo movie. The action is also bloody and incredibly violent in a comic book movie fashion, and Zack Snyder does a great job at getting the atmosphere and the look of a graphic novel translated onto screen, as he's done numerous times throughout his career. However, for me, there was just way too many subplots for this movie's own good, which really hurt the pacing for me, and none of them were as interesting as the Rorschach ones. It really just left this movie feeling like a bloated mess, and at a 2-hour and 42-minute runtime, while there were some awesome scenes and setups throughout the movie, overall there wasn't enough in it to keep me entertained from beginning to end. Number 7, Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice. The way that Snyder approaches expanding and fleshing out this DCEU with this entry, I thought started off very strong. I love the introduction to Bruce Wayne and Metropolis at the end of Man of Steel, seeing the fight between Zod and Superman, as well as the destruction and decimation of lives that it is causing. It sets up Batman's motivation for hating Superman brilliantly. Furthermore, I love the way that Snyder continues to explore how the world and government systems are dealing with the fact that they have this godlike creature on Earth. There are some really great ideas in this movie. Unfortunately, I do think that this movie is a little bit more convoluted for its own good than it needs to be. Lex Luthor in here being the puppeteer to get Batman and Superman to fight ultimately makes no sense. It is kind of pointless. And while I think that they really set up Bruce for having a great motivation of wanting to take down Superman, I never really feel like the movie gets a good handle on why Superman would want to take down Batman. A lot of the reasons that Superman comes up with just makes him look really hypocritical because he's looking at Batman like he's playing judge, jury, and executioner. Meanwhile, Superman's out here taking out people left and right, not caring about who he kills. The movie also really fumbles with getting the Justice League going, and I feel like they introduced these characters in this film very clumsily, very lazily, and they really did not need to be here. It feels so out of place. The movie also takes a really long time to set up the Superman and Batman fight, that when we finally do get them to fight, it's really late into the movie. The fight itself is very cool, but by the time we get there, this movie already feels overbloated. Speaking of cool, the best thing that Batman v Superman has going for it is Batman. Batman in this movie is freaking awesome. Snyder's visual style and eye for action lends itself perfectly to The Dark Knight, and some of the best Batman action sequences, I would argue, happen in this movie. I think this movie is flawed, but I also think this movie is ambitious. I think it's got some fascinating and interesting concepts and ideas. Not all of them, unfortunately, were executed out very well, and I do feel like this movie is buckling under the weight of all the stuff that it's putting upon itself, which makes for a very mixed experience for me. But the Batman stuff is awesome, though. That Batman stuff, he nailed. It's perfect. Rebel Moon Part 1, A Child of Fire, is coming in at number 6. So this is a sci-fi movie that's conceived from a Star Wars pitch that Snyder brought to Lucasfilm that ended up not going anywhere at Lucasfilm. So instead of making it a Star Wars movie, Snyder just brought it over and made it his own original sci-fi movie, which is pretty baller. Now, when it comes to the character work of the characters in this movie, I don't think that Snyder hits it on the head very well. I do think they're a little underdeveloped. I do think that they're pretty stereotypical, and they're not very unique, and they don't really stand out amongst other sci-fi characters that they've kind of copied and pasted that we've seen many times throughout sci-fi history. And on top of that, being conceived from a Star Wars pitch, there is a lot in this that feels like Star Wars, but it kind of feels like diet Star Wars. It definitely feels like Snyder trying to replicate Star Wars elements. But one thing that Snyder does really well with this movie is I think his world building, the worlds that we explore, the creature designs, the whole idea of this government overtaking the galaxy. Again, very Star Wars. But it worked in Star Wars, and I did feel like it worked well enough in Rebel Moon. I don't think it's a great movie. I don't think it's a must-see, but it's also a part 1 of, I believe, a 3-movie trilogy, so there's a lot more to see in this movie, and this is definitely a setup film. They're definitely setting up for where they're going to go in the future, and I will say that I liked Rebel Moon enough that I'm excited to see where they go in the future. Rounding out our top 5, 300. A story of brotherhood and heroism as Leonidas takes his soldiers of 300 Spartans up against the Persian army that's looking to take over their land and the world. The story is pretty simplistic and straightforward, but with that, Zack Snyder is able to take this adaptation from Frank Miller's graphic novel, add his Snyder flair and style to it, and bring the graphic novel onto the big screen. It is filled with so many action sequences of brutal and epic scale. The visuals and cinematography are simply just gorgeous. The story and the characters weren't very compelling to me, but nonetheless, what Snyder is able to bring onto the screen is always entertaining and blood-pumping exciting. Number 4, Dawn of the Dead. A remake of the 1978 thriller classic, Snyder does a really great job at establishing the global crisis of this apocalyptic event through news footage and wide-scoping shots depicting the chaos of the outbreak surrounding our main characters. It establishes the threats, sets up the stakes, and immerses you into this world brilliantly. On top of that, the zombie action in this is a ton of fun with some fantastic makeup and practical effects work. The fact that it's R-rated allows Snyder to just go full on with its R-rated violence, and yeah, sometimes it does get a little bit too gross for me. The birth scene, for example, a little bit too much. And a majority of this movie does take place with our main characters bunkered down in a mall, so I did find that the pacing of the movie did drag a little bit at times in the middle. But as far as gross out, thrilling zombie flicks go, this one definitely checks off all the boxes that it needed to succeed. It's also got a screenplay penned by James Gunn, infusing his charismatic and snappy dialogue throughout the entire runtime of the movie, so that doesn't hurt either. In our top 3, I'm going with Army of the Dead. A return to his roots after his time at DC, Snyder went back to making zombie films, but he also made it his second official original concept and story and screenplay, and made it over with his new deal at Netflix. And I found this movie to be a lot of fun. I like the spin on the zombie genre by making this a heist movie, as well as the twist on how the zombies worked and operated. The decision to have the apocalypse and the outbreak contained to Las Vegas was a real pleasant surprise for me, and with the countdown of a nuke being sent to destroy the place while our main characters are in it, I found that to add some really great stakes to the film. I also found that the group of characters that we follow in this one, anchored in the main character performed by Dave Bautista, they were all a pretty fun group and they were really engaging characters in and of themselves. The R-rated zombie action and violence in this one I found to be a lot of fun, even more fun than in Dawn of the Dead. I also thought that they were helmed and shot better than in Dawn of the Dead, Snyder's first film, so it's pretty cool to see his progression as a director in this one. I do think the tacked on ending was a little bit unnecessary, and the dialogue is a bit clunky at times. Snyder doesn't have James Gunn writing his screenplay this time around. Still, I think there are some really cool concepts and ideas in this movie that were actually executed out pretty well, and also made this movie feel fresh in a genre that's honestly a little oversaturated, so I ended up having a pretty good time with this one. Runner-up, Man of Steel. Crazy divisive when it first came out, and still sparking conversations and debate still to this day. Snyder's take on the Boy Scout superhero of Superman surprised audiences with its deconstruction of the hero and the choices he is forced to make. But that's honestly what I like about the movie. I like that Snyder and the writer David S. Goyer put Superman into the 21st century and made him make choices that were difficult and caused for real consequences. They also chose to look at Superman through as real world of a lens as you could. When Superman is fighting Zod, Metropolis gets decimated. But guess what? If two godlike alien creatures were fighting on Earth, that's what would happen in reality, whether Superman means to or not. Likewise, I also like how the movie challenges Superman with where he belongs and what his place is in the world. And when Zod is making Superman officially make that choice, whether he's for Earth or Krypton, as he's about to kill humans right in front of Superman, Superman has to make the difficult decision to kill Zod, killing off Krypton forever in order to save his newfound family and humanity. And the fact that that choice is final, the fact that that choice has consequences, makes that so compelling and interesting to me. And there are a lot of choices like that with this iteration of Superman in this movie that David S. Goyer and Zack Snyder put him into that I just find fascinating. On the other hand, there are some story elements and the way that this movie is structured that don't work for me. Amy Adams, Lois Lane, I really do not get into the relationship between her and Superman. I feel no chemistry there whatsoever, and a large chunk of this movie depends on that romance, and I just never feel it. All in all, Man of Steel is a flawed movie that fascinates me, that I'm entertained by, and I applaud Snyder and David S. Goyer for taking the risks that they did with this one. And at number 1, Zack Snyder's Justice League, aka the Snyder Cut. Look, I'll be perfectly honest, I was one of those people who never believed that this movie would see the light of day. Hashtag release the Snyder Cut was trending on Twitter day in and day out for years until Warner Brothers finally gave in and they let Snyder complete his vision of Justice League for $70 million and plopped it on HBO Max. And boy, am I glad that they let the man do that. At a runtime of 4 hours, Zack Snyder's Justice League does have some scenes that go on for a little bit too long. There's some things in here that you could cut out and you really wouldn't have an overall effect on the movie. However, with this runtime, Zack Snyder takes full advantage of making this movie a superhero epic. And this movie feels like a superhero epic. With the scope and the scale to go along with this story, Zack Snyder builds up the characters of the Justice League and their dynamics so well. Every character in this movie is given a moment to shine. I mean, they better. He has 4 hours to do so. The villain of Steppenwolf is drastically improved from the theatrical cut, not only making him a much more compelling and intimidating villain, but also giving him a motivation of pleasing his master in Darkseid that is both making the character sympathetic and tragic in a way. The action is absolutely amazing, especially in the third act, which utilizes Zack Snyder's abilities to bring graphic novel depictions onto the big screen brilliantly and perfectly. I was blown away when this movie came out. I'm blown away now by it. The fact that we almost didn't see this almost feels like a crime that was committed. This movie's not perfect, but it is an epic one worthy of carrying the name of Justice League. And with that, guys, that is my ranking for all 10 of Zack Snyder's films. Now that I've watched all of his movies, I gotta say I would consider myself a fan of the guy. I think he puts out some pretty cool stuff for the most part. Now the question goes to you guys. What do you guys think of Zack Snyder films, and how would you rank all 10 of them? Comment down below and let me know. I'd love to hear all your thoughts and opinions about that. And if you're new here and you haven't heard, we have a goal on this channel. We want to hit 2,500 subscribers before the end of the year. We are so close to making it, but we need your help to do so. So if you like talking about Zack Snyder and movies in general, we do that all the time on this channel. I've got my Rebel Moon review up right now if you want to go check that out. But we'd love to have you join us, so consider hitting that subscribe button before you make your way out. And as always, guys, thank you so much for hearing me out, and I hope to talk to you guys again real soon.